Hello, we're just going to wait for them to get enough seats for our panelists. But yes, my name is Stephanie Beasly, and I cover global philanthropy at Devex, and I am going to be talking to a very esteemed panel about inclusiveness in philanthropy. All right, and so joining me on the stage, we have Anne-Birgitte Albrectsen, who also goes by AB, who is the CEO of the Lego Foundation. Next, we have William Moore, CEO of the Eleanor Crook Foundation. We have Lillian Chege, Senior Advisor at Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. And we do have a little switcheroo from Ford Foundation. Instead of Monica Elimon, we have Aparna Uppaluri, hopefully I'm saying that right, who is the Acting Program Director for India, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. She's also a Program Officer for Gender, Racial, and Ethnic Justice at Ford. Thank you all so much for being here. So we're having this discussion about inclusion in philanthropy, and I want to go back to this moment about 2 years ago. We were in the middle of what we now know is a long pandemic, and there was this incident in the US, the murder of George Floyd, that sparked this global racial reckoning. And we saw lots of pledges and commitments come out, and I think within the philanthropy sector, there were questions about the role philanthropy could play in driving an agenda that really did center people from marginalized communities, women, LGBTQ people. And so I want to go back to that and sort of have everybody think about, how you were thinking about the role of philanthropy, what you thought maybe your organizations could accomplish, and what that looks like now. What have you learned in those 2 years about what you actually can do from the philanthropy sector on this issue? And what does that look like at your organization? And I'll start with you, William, since you're to my immediate right.
Is it on? Hi, everybody. Will Moore with the Eleanor Crook Foundation. Like most everybody, foundations, corporations, after the murder of George Floyd, we did send out that email with a list of things that we really felt like we could do to be a more equitable work environment and use our immense privilege as a donor to promote equity and inclusion outside of our team at the Eleanor Crook Foundation. We have met most of those goals. This event was a good spur to go back and look.
And could you describe the goals you had?
Yeah, so I'll talk about a couple of them. The first one was to make our team more diverse, and that's the one that we are still working on. But we went back and looked, and 90% of our team is a member of at least one protected class, including myself as a gay man. But there's still other segments of our community, especially folks from the communities that we serve in Africa, that we'd like to see more represented on our team. In terms of another commitment that we made that I'm excited that we're following through with, I think we've done a lot of good work as a sector. When I say as a sector, as the international development sector that I work in, and I know there are folks here from other sectors, but a social goods sector, I think we've made a lot of progress in at least ensuring that minority candidates or potentially discriminated candidates from potentially discriminated against classes at least get considered for top jobs in this sector. Again, more work to be done there, but you look at even when I came into this sector 8 years ago to now, executive suites look different. And I think that's good, and we should keep doing that. Where I don't think we've focused nearly enough is early career opportunity. Recruiting folks from different backgrounds into this sector and making sure that they have the opportunity to start working in this sector. And so what we committed to doing was to providing scholarships for folks from historically Black colleges and universities to come into the international development sector. And we're following through on that commitment with the United Nations Foundation. I started my career as a UN intern. UN interns in this city, they work 12-hour days and they are paid $0. And we actually, our group of interns, we looked diverse. I mean, we had someone from Thailand, someone from China, someone from Venezuela, but the Thai woman on our team was a member of Thai royalty. The Chinese woman on our team was the daughter of a Chinese billionaire, and the Venezuelan guy on our team was the son of an ambassador. And that's, of course, how it's going to be if you have to live and work for free in one of the most expensive cities of the world. So we are excited to be rolling out these paid internship opportunities with the UN Foundation. And I want to make a plug for that because this is starting small for just a couple dozen positions. We want to get this up to at least 100 positions next year. So if any of you know other funders who would be interested in making those opportunities available for paid internships at the UN, please get in touch with us. We'd love to co-fund that with you.
Well, somebody could get a job there. So I want to turn to you, Aparna, because I know over at Ford Foundation, you all have really taken the lead. When people talk about diversity and inclusion, people often mention, to me at least, the Ford Foundation. And so I wonder if you could sort of talk about where you all were, I guess, in 2020, what your commitment looked like, and maybe how it looks to you now at the foundation.
Thank you. I'm Aparna Uppaluri from the India, Nepal, Sri Lanka office of the Ford Foundation. And I want to begin with myself a little bit. I think it's really reflective of the commitment and the courage of our leadership that here I am, a woman of color from the global South. English is not my first language. And here representing a global foundation that has really tried to center the values of DEI, but really, when we say diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think where Ford has really been different and has really built its public voice and narrative is around the meaning that it has attributed to these words. Like, what do we mean when we say diversity? What do we mean when we say equity? What do we mean when we say inclusion? Because we often know that these become checkbox terms. And I think where our leadership of our president and our leadership team has really invested in the last couple of years and even longer, and I think really, Stephanie, 2020, of course, was a huge racial reckoning in this country, but the pandemic hit also the whole world at the same time, where inequality, along the lines of race, gender, caste, and all other multiple forms of marginalization or oppression really were magnified. And so I think there are two different arenas in which I think that reckoning was taken very seriously. One is in the external work that we do through our grant making and our programming and our public voice and narrative, but also it was a moment of reckoning for us internally as to, are we on the inside what we aspire to be on the outside? Of course, there was the launch of our big social justice bond grant of $1 billion to really look at the rebuilding of civil society potential to be able to sustain and be resilient to respond to the issues of social justice and inequality. The launch of the Black Feminist Fund, which was a historic fund for Black women by Black women. And also just shortly before that, also the launch of the Foundation's first disability grant making allocation, recognizing that over 1 billion people in the world live with disabilities. So I think it really is, there was this very sort of broad scope of looking at what was happening outside. But 2020 was a moment of internal reflection and saying, what do we need to do to change ourselves internally to be able to do a better job externally? And I think there, the mantra of the disability rights movement, which is nothing about us without us, is something that began to really resonate with us, to really look at. So we did a staff survey, an anonymous staff survey, to really understand how is it that staff were feeling about DEI principles. And we launched on a very deep revisioning exercise, and have now sort of committed to looking at diversity as something that moves beyond representation to a deeper understanding, appreciation, and celebration of difference, really, to looking at equity as something that moves beyond fairness to really pushing at the structures of power and looking at where decision-making power lies within the foundation, and who is it that's making those decisions on how and where resources flow. And inclusion is not just a principle of counting, but as something that really assesses the sense of belonging and welcoming for within our staff. And what we discovered that we weren't doing as well on those indicators as we would like to. So we're now on a 5-year exercise to actually rebuild these structures. And I think that has taken a lot of courage and commitment from our leadership to really invest and capacitate all of our staff to fine-tune, sharpen our own inner DNA as staff who work for a social justice foundation, to build both integrity and accountability, in how we function internally.
And I'm really glad that you mentioned too disability, disabled people who have disabilities, I should say, because I think that's something that is not often considered part of this discussion when you talk about diversity and inclusion. And another group, we heard here earlier today about how children were especially impacted by the COVID pandemic. And of course, the Lego Foundation focuses on children. And I know that you've also done some work on gender equality. So I wonder if AB, you could talk a little bit too about what it means to try to include children in these conversations, what diversity looks like for an organization that's focused on children, and how you're sort of going about that too, because I know you started at Lego in 2021, so you came after this whole reckoning. So yeah, what does it look like for you?
Maybe just start a slightly different place, but just to say that the conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion looks and feels quite a bit different in Europe than it does in the US. It's not that we're not talking about it, but it shows up in quite a different place. And I think the conversation here in the US and in the UK has a similar feel, but when you then move into mainland Europe, it looks and feels quite different. Sometimes it feels as if it really needs a big wake-up call. And sometimes it also just feels like, well, our context is very different, and there's a learning journey that has to start in a completely different place. So when I look at the Lego Foundation today, we're on an internal learning journey. We're on a journey of re-examining how we show up as a funder, and also looking at what we fund. And for the Lego Foundation, the core dream of the future of learning and education is an inclusive system. It's a system where every child is at the center, no matter who they are, what their backgrounds are. We have this wonderful appreciation for how play in its essence, that's the superpower of children, how that creates interaction and appreciation and empathy and creativity, and kids don't see many of the barriers that we older people see, and there's something in the power of play that in and of itself makes a learning and experience environment a lot more inclusive. I'll give you an example. We work with a UK-based organization called Play Included, working with children with autism, and the sheer fact that you change, for example, and we don't always use Lego bricks in our projects, but in this case we do, the sheer fact that you change the manual for building a Lego set so that two children can build, and where one sorts the bricks and one builds the bricks, and children with almost no language, and with the inhibitions of social engagement that comes with autism, all of a sudden those barriers break down, and play in itself helps the children become included, see themselves as included, see themselves as part of a bigger team. We've worked for years with children, some of the most marginalized and excluded children, which are children in crisis situations, in refugee camps, etc. So our programming in many respects has been way ahead of our internal learning and discovery journey. And that learning and discovery journey is one that we're on right now.
That's a really interesting point that you brought up about the work you're doing, sort of being ahead of where you are internally. And I think that's an interesting question too. How do you sort of approach diversity and inclusion in the work that you want to do, but also tackle it in-house? And I think, Aparna, you talked a little bit about that at Ford, but I think for a lot of foundations, not only do they have the issue of how this shows up in their grant making and the work that they're doing in the world, but how it shows up within their own teams and how people are feeling within their own teams. And one thing I'm sort of curious about, as somebody who's worked at places where there are all sorts of diversity and equity sort of initiatives, have been on pipeline committees before, I feel like a lot of times a lot of this work will fall on the people who are in the marginalized communities, unpaid labor, because it's just in addition to the work they're already doing. And so I wonder if you all can talk a little bit about that, how you kind of create accountability and checks within your organizations to make sure that it's not happening, and how, to make sure that people actually feel like that there's their teeth to these commitments. So I guess I'll go back. Lillian, do you want to?
Certainly, I can jump in. Lillian Chege with RPA here. I'm so happy you asked that question, because of a woman of color, a person who's been perhaps the only in the room around the table for many, many years throughout my career. It's been lonely. And our approach at RPA to inclusion, diversity inclusion, has been, this is not just a practice. This is a value that has to be embedded throughout every aspect of our organization. So like what's been said, the recent events shook us all to the core, shook us personally. And so at RPA, we've prioritized DEI, have made it beyond just really focusing and building out DEI, a solid DEI statement. It's a bold statement that is actionable. We have a committee, a DEI council, that actually holds us accountable and helps evangelize, and it's a council that has a budget, has an action plan, so they can undertake some activities. And when you talk about DEI as a value, and it has to be a value which has to be executed and embraced by everyone across the organization. So to help ensure that, we've embedded components of DEI principles in our performance management process. And so all of a sudden, this is a shared value. All of a sudden, we have allies in this journey. And some of us who've been at the fore can sort of stand back, and not stand back all the way, but just take a breath and have others, pitch in. So that's how RPA has really tried to ensure that this is a shared value and not, like Aparna said, a tick the box exercise. It is embedded through our practice. In our DEI statement is actually serving as the bedrock for our strategic plan, with people and culture central to that agenda. So we are not just seeing this as something in black and white, something on a piece of paper. It is fundamental to our existence as an entity.
And so I want to continue with this theme of accountability. And I know, again, Aparna, you mentioned like a survey that was taken at Ford, and I wanted to ask AB and Will a little bit about what you all are doing to sort of review, both with your staff, but also with grantees. Like, how are you trying to make sure that they are feeling engaged by this, and that their voices are included, and that you're actually creating equitable changes? I'll start with AB.
So we've recently adopted a new strategic plan. We've also baked inclusion equity and diversity into that. We've just created a new Center for Inclusion and recruited a senior leader from Ford Foundation, because we also feel that they have led the way, and maybe we can learn something from them. I think internally, one of our folks, we set targets for our staffing. We've brought on more diversity in our board. We've done different things, etc. But fundamentally, what we're trying to measure is well-being and safety, psychological safety. Every staff need to feel that they can show up as their whole self, and every aspect of their identity can come to the fore, and they don't have to feel worried about that. So for us, one of the ways of measuring diversity and inclusion in the workplace is to measure psychological safety and ask some really pointed questions of staff about how they feel when they come to work. The other thing that we've done, and we are constantly having feedback loops on how it's working, is every major or even minor change we make in the organization decision is co-created with staff. And sometimes you say that and it doesn't really happen, or sometimes you do things and you haven't quite walked the talk. But if you have constant feedback mechanisms, and you have whether it's your staff councils or value bearers in the organization, or speak up champions, or whatever it is you have in an organization that allow you to test it, you can constantly course correct. So the accountability loop also becomes an immediate feedback and saying, okay, oh gosh, we said something stupid again, or we did something, etc. Because we're all on a learning journey. This is not something you can put on a formula. You just have to exercise it all the time. Let me stop there. Give space for others.
Well,
yeah, I think for us too, internally, it's been a lot of conversations. To go back to what you said earlier about often it falling on people of color to sort of be the ones who are guiding the organization. We're a small team. We're under 15 people on our team. We're a young team. Our leadership team's a young team. We've been learning on the job about everything, and including this on our journey as a foundation. But when we were having some of those early conversations in 2021, we were discussing one of these issues about whether or not we were where we needed to be. I don't remember what exactly it was, but on a DEI issue. And we had a pause in the conversation, and one of the women of color on our team said, I feel like everyone's looking at me for the answer on this. And she was not part of our leadership team, but I think there was probably some truth to that. And that was a real learning moment for me. And after that, talked to our leadership team and said, we can't be doing this that way. You're going to have to find an expert on this issue. We're going to need to do some benchmarking, make sure that we have what we need in place. We're not as big as some of these other organizations, so we couldn't hire a whole division. We don't even have a full-time HR person. But it did lead to us putting some more systems in place and bringing in some outside consultancy support. In terms of how we engage with our grantees, we have a non-discrimination and equity clause in all of our grant contracts, and we take that very seriously. And actually, we have terminated grants, big grants, because our grant managers observed dynamics that were not appropriate between management, HQ, Global North staff, and the local Global South staff that were really doing most of the work on the ground. So we do take it seriously.
I think that's really interesting. And sort of my follow-up to this is a question I've had about accountability still. But, a lot of this, I think, for members of our audience, this might be the first time they're hearing about some of the initiatives you all have, some of the things you're doing. And, philanthropy doesn't have watchdog agencies. It isn't something, it's not like the government, which of course I used to report on, where you would get like a big report and it's telling you all the ways in which they spent the money, et cetera, where they went wrong, where it went right. So I want to ask about, your transparency and how you plan to talk to the public about like what you're doing? You know, how are you going to engage with them and show them that this is more than just, as somebody mentioned, a checkbox? This is something you all are actually doing. And I think I'll start with you, Aparna.
Thank you, Stephanie. So, I mentioned that survey because it was a very important tool, and we made sure that it was an anonymous survey to measure precisely what AB you were talking about, which is the psychological well-being and security that the staff feel, because I think that's a far better measure of how well your DEI is working, compared to just, do you have the right numbers, right? So I think that the public voice and narrative piece that I was talking about, I think we begin right at the top. In the matter of the last 5 years, we've seen our leadership team at Ford from being primarily men to having 7 out of 10 women leaders, and 5 out of those 7 being women of color. And most of them are women with school-going children, right? So we're really talking about a younger, more diverse, women-led organization than we've ever had in the past historically. That's part of our public accountability. So, it's really beginning with walking the talk in that way. The second piece, I think, is the commitment that we had. Ford is a large organization. We have 10 offices across the world, Latin America, Africa, and Asia, and of course, our largest operation in the United States. But we did recognize that, fish can't see water. Like, we can't see our own problem. So it was important for us to bring on accompaniment to help us actually diagnose the problem. But this was an engagement that we went on this journey through a very dedicated steering process, which had thought leaders and value leaders within the organization who were accompanied by external support. And what that did was it actually built a very strong accountability framework internally within the organization, where we were also holding our external consultants, stakeholders accountable to a higher standard than if we just had left it to them, right, to just produce a report for us. Because this really was a values exercise. And I think so for us, given that, we're a philanthropy that also in some sense overall self-regulates. Of course, we're subject to regulatory principles in all the countries where we do our grant making, but our internal functioning is really very self-regulatory. And so there, I think that public accountability in terms of how our diversity is represented, how we interact with our grantee organizations. We also conduct a survey of our grantee organizations and seek feedback on how they have experienced working with us in terms of our inclusivity, the way that we have respected diversity. Our proposal questionnaires for grants, which we have really simplified, actually have 2 questions that focus on DEI, but also recognize that for organizations that are small and stressed and are working in resource poor conditions, we need to also accompany them on these journeys and not put just the pressure on them to achieve these targets. So just having those 2 questions in this questionnaire has shifted a lot in terms of activating the way that grantee organizations think about DEI, and that's how. So, and we learn from them, and I think that's been our greatest source of learning is recognizing that the external work that we're doing sometimes is so much farther ahead than what we've been able to do internally. So there is this pipeline of knowledge that we're really trying to invest in and build, which then sort of integrates the integrity and accountability principle on which we're trying to build our DEI ecosystem.
I would certainly like to jump in here. Internally, we're doing a lot of similar. We're taking on a lot of similar initiatives. But at RPA, I've also seen us build out business practices such as fiscal sponsorship that actually address the organizations you just alluded to, organizations that have been marginalized from traditional funding purposes. We act as fiscal sponsors for individual for organizations that have to meet some benchmarks, because we are certainly accountable to the IRS and other regulatory bodies. However, we've seen how philanthropy can be democratized by building this out. And what that has required is for our own internal profile to also shift, because if you're going to start embracing and allowing organizations and projects to come in, you need staff that's culturally that has a cultural competencies, the knowledge, the incentive to really handhold some of our partners that don't have those structures, that don't have that bandwidth to sort of implement the work in the way our donors and our funder partners are expecting. So internally, I've seen a fiscal commitment and practices within RPA so that our DEI initiatives show up not just internally, but show up in who we partner with, and what little steps we take to start helping move the agenda and the needle forward. So I just wanted to offer that.
Yeah, and I think I know we're getting close to time, but I think that's an interesting point too, to talk about like partnerships and how you make sure these values are included in the partnerships. And Will, I was really interested in what you said about ending some relationships because of how your partner acted in this area. And so I guess I want to sort of end by asking about like the evolution of diversity and inclusion. And we had a conversation here earlier today about like LGBTQ community and some of the unique threats that people in that community face. And it made me think about, how the conversation there has evolved. You have lots of conversations on social media about, the divide between generations about like non-binary and binary people, cisgender, like terms that people don't understand. Latinx was another big one that sparked controversy. So I think my question is, how do you keep evolving, as diversity and inclusion, what that looks like changes, and it changes based, of course, on where you are in the world. How do you leave space in an action plan to make room for these changes? I mean, 5 years from now, we could be talking about something else. So I'll start with you, AB.
I wish I fully knew, but I do think, the only way is to just keep interrogating the issue of power and just constantly have it on the agenda. We have a lot of power of the purse of where we sit, where we are, etc. We need to turn accountability on its head. We've talked a lot about accountability as if it's accountability to you or whatever. For us, it's accountability to the children we serve, and then figure out, what does that mean? What tools do kids and their families need to hold us to account? Just to give you an example, we do a lot of research and data collection, etc. We are incredibly extractive. How do we find safe, smart technological solutions to put that back into the hands of kids so that they can use that data both to hold their own systems to account, but to hold us to account? How do we constantly create dialogue that centers around what those that we say we serve, what they truly want, rather than what we think they want? And that comes with all sorts of double and triple dimensions when you're talking about kids, because talk about an excluded body in our society, regardless of color, race, ethnicity, gender, whatever. We just don't take kids seriously, and most of the time they have a lot more answers to their particular problems than we do. So there's a whole mind shift in terms of, and listening to kids, just to end that will also keep us really smart about what's coming. Because they're leading the thinking on what good looks like.
Great. William, I'll go with you.
Yeah, first of all, I think it's going to take continuing to just keep this on the agenda in a very intentional way. And I really appreciate this panel. And I think we're just going to have to keep having these because everybody's got busy lives. We've all are trying to tackle really big problems. And it is easy to just kind of keep focusing day, and not think, where are we going on these DEI issues? So some of it I think is going to have to be intentional. And on the LGBT stuff in particular, that's one where we are really not doing what we need to be doing in the international development sector. I mean, we still have atrocious issues happening to LGBT people in most parts of the world, very few protections, and it is not something that we like to talk about at the UN or in the State Department or at USAID. And it shouldn't be tolerated, just in the same way that we decided at some point that we weren't going to tolerate discrimination against women, regardless of local customs and beliefs. I think we need to do that with LGBT issues as well. I also think some of it is going to happen naturally from here, because it's going to be what works. It's going to be what finally solves a lot of these problems. The issue that we're focused on, hunger and malnutrition, I mean, the people whose kids are dying of hunger or other preventable causes under the age of 2, these are the people that are the very most discriminated against in the world. And for a long time, we really just haven't brought them into the conversation. They haven't been part of the solution. They've been recipients. They've been passive. And we've thrown billions of dollars at that. And we've made some progress, but I don't think we're going to get the second half of the way there by continuing to do it that way. And what's going to work is going to be finding these more inclusive approaches. So, for instance, for us at the Eleanor Crook Foundation, probably the biggest change in our strategy over the next few years is going to be moving away a lot of our program funding from large international organizations and really embedding in a series of focus countries and getting to know local partners and supporting those local partners in government and civil society directly, rather than just assuming it's happening with the global institutions that we're funding. So I think it's going to be what gives us results. So it's going to be what we do.
Great. I know we are standing between people and their cocktails, but I wanted to give you all an opportunity, Lillian and Aparna, if you had any thoughts on this, the future.
I think Will stole my thoughts. I just want to leave us. We have to be comfortable with the discomfort. We must keep having these really difficult conversations. So many people have been marginally excluded from this space. We need to open our minds, we need to open our hearts, and we just need to be talking to those whom we have not engaged with in the past. I would also like to add that the power dynamics are also shifting. This space is getting bigger and broader. We have high net worth individuals, we have corporations, we have private foundations. Those who have been traditionally deemed most influential are also now being challenged. So I feel like organically, as Will said, things are starting to shift. And just be open and be comfortable with constantly revisiting, recalibrating as you learn, because shame on us if we don't change once we know that we need to do better. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Just, quick last word. I think, yes, we have to examine power, dismantle power, but also really look at how we build power and who builds that power, who makes the decisions about where and how that power is built. And I think that's the balance that we're going to have to strike, in our external work and in our grant making, moving towards more participatory grant making approaches, changing the look and feel and color of how we look internally and how we activate our own internal resources. But most importantly, I think really understanding that it's the binaries that are going to keep breaking down, and so the relationship between identity and power will always be shifting, and we can't rest.
Well, thank you all so much for all your thoughts on diversity, inclusion.